Good day. Today is Friday, 28th March 2025, and as you will have noticed, my voice is far from its normal self. On Wednesday, I did my program as normal, but I didn't point out that my voice was not perhaps quite as strong as it usually is. That's what I said at the start of the program. Then in the last 15 minutes of the program, it came under extreme strain and I was barely able to finish the video. Then I attempted to do a live stream on our locals platform on Wednesday, which is a regular live stream I do for the Duran community there. I found it impossible, and yesterday I had no voice at all. Today, well, the voice is gradually coming back, but I'm not going to pretend that it is as strong as usual. As I said, it is only gradually returning to itself. And for that reason, I'm going to try to put as little strain on it as I can. Nonetheless, a lot has been going on over the last couple of days. And for that reason, and given that my voice is gradually coming back, I've decided to do a program today. Briefly, where are we? Well, yesterday, the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, made a very interesting and, in some ways, I suspect, very important speech whilst visiting Murmansk, north of the Arctic Circle, in Russia's far north. Murmansk is a major industrial center and also a naval base. He he toured one particular Russian submarine, the Arkhangelsk, where he made his speech to the sailors, and he also participated in the launch of a similar submarine, though one with Zircon missiles, over the course of which it was disclosed, by the way, that the Zircon, the hypersonic cruise missile, which is now being distributed to the Russian Navy, that the Zircon comes in two variants, one with a longer range than the other, which is interesting and something perhaps to discuss in another program. Anyway, over the course of this visit, he made his speech. Now, this visit comes directly after the meeting in Riyadh of the American and Russian expert parties, the agreement in principle, or rather the agreement between the Americans and the Russians, I'm not sure it's an agreement in principle, to return to the Black Sea Initiative, the initiative that allows shipping to transit the Black Sea from Ukrainian ports, in many cases carrying food. I've discussed this Black Sea Initiative many times. It was first floated by the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres back in 2022. The Russians agreed to it then. There were all kinds of provisions that in return for the Russians not interfering with commercial shipping from Ukrainian ports in the Black Sea, one of their major banks, the Russian Agricultural Bank, would be reconnected to the SWIFT interbank payment messaging system, and that the European Union would lift restrictions on trade in Russian agricultural products, fertilizer and food and that sort of thing. Well, the European Union did not do any of those things, and the Russians also became increasingly aggrieved that Ukrainian commercial ships, in contravention of the agreement that Guterres had negotiated, were, according to the Russians, trafficking in weapons which were being supplied to Ukraine, and that the inspection regime that had been agreed with Turkey, wasn't working properly. So in July 2023, the Russians pulled out of the agreement. It's important to reiterate, though, a point I have made many times, that despite the fact that they pulled out of the agreement, the Russians took no steps to interfere with commercial shipping in the Black Sea. That continued as normal. Now, on the 18th of March, when Trump and Putin spoke to each other by phone, Putin agreed to Trump's proposal that the Black Sea Initiative, the grain deal, be revived. A meeting took place earlier this week in Riyadh between American and Russian experts to see whether the Black Sea Initiative could be revived. The Russians said, fine, we're absolutely willing to agree to its revival, but we do want all the provisions that made up the original grain deal of 2022, this time brought back. We want the Russian Agricultural Bank reconnected to SWIFT. We want the sanctions on our foodstuffs, export of our foodstuffs, lifted. And as I've pointed out in previous programs, if you compare the very brief American readouts with the very detailed Russian readout, it's quite clear, at least to me, that the American negotiators in Riyadh basically agreed with what the Russians were demanding. The American readout, though it's sketchy and ambiguous in places, isn't inconsistent with the Russian readout, which fills out the details. Well, that was the agreement the Americans and the Russians appeared to have entered into on Tuesday, after the publication of the two readouts, the Russian and the American one. On Wednesday, the European Union issued a statement. Its press spokesman issued a statement in which they rejected outright any proposal to lift sanctions, to lift any of the sanctions that the Russians said needed to be lifted in order to make the Black Sea Initiative work. And in the hours that have followed, there's been another meeting of EU leaders, this time in Paris, this time chaired by Emmanuel Macron. This meeting was intended to discuss, there's another one of these endless meetings to discuss potential deployment of European peacekeeping forces to Ukraine once a ceasefire there is agreed. Well, the meeting took place, and over the course of it, the European leaders again made clear that they're not prepared to lift the sanctions, that this is not something that they are prepared to do. The Russian Agricultural Bank is not going to be reconnected to the SWIFT interbank messaging system. And there is no real sign, as of this moment, that the European Union is prepared to do any of the things in terms of sanctions relief that the Americans and the Russians agreed on Tuesday in order to get the Black Sea Initiative, the grain deal, working again. And at this point, I'm not really sure where we go. Now, there's been an article about this by Mark Episcopos in Responsible Statecraft. Will EU stand in the way of Russia-Ukraine ceasefire? The European Union appears to have put a stick in the spokes of a beleaguered Black Sea ceasefire agreement between Russia and the United States. The US and Russian negotiators, after 12 hours long talks in Riyadh, coalesced on Tuesday around an expanded partial ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, covering the Black Sea and energy infrastructure. The Kremlin indicated the deal is contingent on removal of sanctions on the Russian Agricultural Bank and its reconnection to the SWIFT international messaging system. And by the way, a lot of other items of sanctions relief as well. And then Mark Episkopos then goes on to say that some Ukrainian and Western outlets claimed that Russia foisted the sanctions relief as an added condition in an ex post facto way after the initial agreement had already been negotiated. In reality, if you look at the American readout, it's quite clear that the Americans did agree to all of these Russian conditions. And it's striking that even Mark Episkopos doesn't seem to realize that these terms, the reconnection of the Russian Agricultural Bank to SWIFT, of the sanctions relief on Russian agricultural exports, were things that had already apparently been agreed, including by the European Union back in 2022, when the initial Black Sea initiative was agreed. No one ever says this in any of the commentary that I've seen. You find no discussion of this fact in that commentary. But there it is. Episkopos seems somewhat stunned that despite this American-European agreement, the Europeans have taken the decision that they have. He says it is unclear on the level of institutional decision-making whether this obviously unviable condition for sanctions relief, which is to say what the European Union said, the complete withdrawal of all Russian troops from Ukrainian territory, is merely an instance of bureaucratic inertia or part of a premeditated European strategy to hinder progress on US-Russian talks to end the war in Ukraine. And in fact, we have had the answer, because the following day, all of these European leaders, Macron, Starmer, Ursula, all of them met in Paris, and they agreed that the sanctions not only should remain in place, but in fact should be intensified. So the Europeans have, in effect, torpedoed the resurrection of the Black Sea initiative. As I said in previous programs, in terms of the situation on the ground, or on the sea to be more precise, this doesn't actually make any real difference. Commercial shipping continues to transit the Black Sea without interference. You don't actually need the Black Sea initiative to make that happen. But it is, in effect, two fingers at the President of the United States, Donald Trump, from the Europeans putting up two fingers at him. They say you might want to come to these agreements with the Russians, but the decision to lift the sanctions here is ours, and we're not going to lift them. We're going to keep things exactly as we are. And Episkopos says this: in the long term, it is difficult to see how the international sanctions regime on Russia can maintain its coherence and effectiveness without continued US backing. In either case, an alleged disagreement between Russia and the United States over sanctions relief is a tactical issue that can be remedied in future talks. I'm not so sanguine about that, by the way. A principled stance by the EU against lifting any sanctions pending Russia's unconditional withdrawal from Ukraine is a much more serious issue that stands a not insignificant chance of vitiating already delicate US-Russia peace talks. Well, that is exactly where we are. Now, if you've been listening to these programs on this channel over the last couple of weeks, if you've been listening to us on the Duran, you will have seen that we have repeatedly said that the European states, the European Union, the major European powers, Germany, France, Britain, are adamantly hostile to this whole process of US-Russia rapprochement. They regard it with horror. They don't want to see the kind of negotiated outcome to the conflict in Ukraine, which the Americans look willing to concede and which the Russians are insisting on. And they will do everything they can to block progress to that end. They did that again in Paris. They rejected the proposed sanctions relief. And they also, once again, talked about the reassurance force they're going to send to Ukraine. It's now quite clear that this reassurance force has now dwindled to an enterprise of just Britain and France. Macron, who was chairing the meeting, made some extraordinarily belligerent statements. He repeated again that as far as he was concerned, the Russians had no say on this matter. If there's a ceasefire, Ukraine can just ask for troops from Europe to be deployed in Ukraine, and it's purely a question then between the Europeans and the Ukrainians. He also said that if the Russians attack those troops, they will defend themselves. He didn't explain how. And anyway, the tone was extremely confrontational with the British and the French and the other European leaders, again, putting the blame on the Russians for the failure to make progress in any ceasefire talks. Essentially, they seem to be expecting or demanding that the Russians simply capitulate, which of course they're not going to do. So we can see that the Europeans, who are, by the way, entirely frozen out of this negotiation process between the Americans and the Russians, that the Europeans are hostile and trying to sabotage the process. They won't lift sanctions when the Russians and the Americans agree. They continue to talk about deploying European troops to Ukraine, whether the Russians are happy with it or not. And coming back to Macron, he even suggested for the first time that if the Americans refuse to guarantee the safety of those European troops, if they refuse to provide a backstop, well, the European troops might, in that case, just as well be deployed anyway. I am going to repeat again my own view. This is almost entirely bluff. The British military are apparently increasingly hostile to the idea of a deployment in Ukraine. Apparently Parliament would have to be consulted, and I suspect that there would be dissident voices in Parliament this time. Some people will stand up and would oppose this, especially on the Conservative side. And I don't know what the legal position is in France and whether Macron has to consult the French Parliament, the National Assembly. But if he does, I suspect the French National Assembly will say no. The point is, floating this idea of a European deployment force, sending, as the British and French are now doing, military officials to Kiev in order to discuss how to deploy this force. Its primary purpose is, again, one, to bring the Europeans into this negotiating process between the Americans and the Russians, to insert themselves into this process, the better, so as to sabotage it. And secondly, to create a deal breaker one that would force the entire process to collapse anyway, because the Russians will not agree to it. In my opinion, and I'm going to say this again, I think that the Trump administration has not handled this whole topic well. Trump seems to believe that what the Europeans do really is not his concern, even as he seeks to negotiate a peace agreement with the Russians. He doesn't seem to understand that it is very much a Russian concern, and that in order to reach that peace agreement with the Russians, Trump really does need to make sure that he's got the Europeans safely on side. What he needs to do in order to move the process with the Russians forward successfully is to make it absolutely clear to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians. And Zelensky has again been lobbying hard for these military deployments, only he says that the troops that are sent to Ukraine should not be a peacekeeping force at all. They should be a war-fighting force, ready and willing to take on the Russians, which, by the way, is what I've been saying all along. But anyway, Trump needs to explain both to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans that this is not a non-starter, that it is interfering in American diplomacy and getting in the way of American negotiations with the Russians, that the United States not only does not support this initiative, but straightforwardly opposes it. And if that were to happen, that would kill the initiative stone dead and would facilitate the process of negotiation. But for whatever reason, again, Trump doesn't seem to understand this. Maybe he's been listening too much to people like General Kellogg and Mike Waltz, his national security advisor, and the result is that this chatter about deployment of peacekeeping forces from Europe has gone on and on with, well, the result that we see. So, this is where we are. A meeting with the Russians and the Americans in Riyadh on Tuesday, 12 and a half hours of discussions, the outlines of a return, in fact not just the outlines, the details of how to go back to the Black Sea Initiative, hammered out between them, and in reality, absolutely nothing has changed. The Europeans have said no, and the Black Sea Initiative remains inoperable. We do have the 30-day ceasefire on attacks on energy systems, and the Russians have set out a narrow list of targets that are covered by this ceasefire. But even this ceasefire is starting to look very fragile. Today, Putin's spokesman Peskov said the Russian side reached understanding and in agreements with the US counterparts. At the same time, the Russian side reserves the right, in case of failure of the Kiev regime, to comply with the ceasefire, certainly not to follow it also. Probably it would be illogical for us to observe and face every night attempts at striking against facilities of our own energy infrastructure. So what Peskov is saying is that for the moment, Russia will comply with its side of the ceasefire. The Russians have backdated it to the 18th of March, saying that this is when the ceasefire came into effect. This is when Putin and Trump spoke with each other. The Ukrainians have never given their own date as to when they think this ceasefire begins. Just a sec. There might be some argument or disagreement about this, but my own view is that the Russians will comply with the ceasefire for what they say is the 30-day period, but they will not go beyond that. if the Ukrainians continue to breach the ceasefire, at some point the Russians will refuse to roll it over and will regard the ceasefire as ended. And if we ever get to that point, by the way, then one can say pretty much goodbye to the entire peace initiative. At that point, it will effectively have come to an end. Now, the Russians are talking in this way, notwithstanding that we now have, by the way, some actual information about the true level of damage that the Ukrainian attacks on the Russian energy system have been causing. And apparently someone did a detailed study in the West and came to the view that overall the damage done would cost Russia something like $5 billion to repair. And that against Russian exports of oil and gas, which produce funding for Russia of around $20 billion a month. As I've said, these are pinprick attacks, and we now have some evidence, some information that appears to confirm this. Anyway, I've gone through all of this in some detail because this is the background. This all provides the background to Vladimir Putin's speech in Murmansk. To be clear, we've had quite a number of contacts between the Americans and the Russians up to now. There have been 2 long telephone conversations between Putin and Trump. There's been 2 intense meetings between the Russians and the Americans in Riyadh. Witkoff has come to Russia and he's had meetings with Putin himself and with other Russian officials. But as of now, nothing very substantive has been agreed. There's talk about a ceasefire by Easter, by the 20th of April. The lead Russian negotiator, Grigory Karasin, has said today that it's welcome that the United States is looking to achieve a ceasefire by that day. That shows that they are keen to achieve a ceasefire. But for the moment, it must be said, there is very little progress in that direction. The Europeans are not happy with this process and they're obstructing it. The Ukrainians are obviously unhappy with this process and they too are obstructing it. And it has been very interesting to watch the response of the Trump administration to the events of the last couple of days. They've said nothing about the alleged violations of the ceasefire on attacks on the energy systems by either by the Russians or by the Ukrainians over the last couple of days. They've not criticized either party or expressed concern that the ceasefire is being violated. And they have had absolutely nothing to say about the fact that the Europeans have rejected the sanctions relief that the Russians clearly insisted on at the meeting on Monday in Riyadh, the meeting which undoubtedly saw the Americans agreeing to that sanctions relief. The Americans have been completely silent, and they have given no indication as of the time of making this program that they have any real idea how to move forward. It doesn't look as if the Black Sea Initiative is going to be revived. The existing brief 30-day ceasefire is not fully working. Putin set out detailed conditions on how a wider ceasefire should be administered, which he basically said need to be addressed. There's been no word from the United States about any of that. Trump has said that the US officials will meet to discuss some of these Russian demands, both about the main ceasefire, but also about the Black Sea Initiative. But there's been no word of such a meeting. I have to say that as of the time of making of this program, this relentless momentum that we have seen from the Americans since mid-February to try and get a ceasefire agreed as quickly as possible, to try to get the war ended as quickly as possible, that seems to have come to a stop. It's as if the Americans, finding the process much more complicated and far more difficult than they had imagined, are unsure what to do and are not saying anything and are not proposing any action. I say that because there's been no word of any new meetings planned between the Americans and the Russians. There's no word of a telephone call being arranged between Putin and Trump to see whether the logjam can be broken. Nor is there any sign of the United States contacting its European allies, telling them that the stance taken in Paris over the Black Sea Initiative, the refusal to relax the sanctions, is unacceptable, that the United States strongly disagrees with this decision, and that if the Europeans persist in it and continue to obstruct negotiations in the way that they are doing, the United States will take unilateral action, which could, for example, involve the United States undertaking, separately from the Europeans, significant sanctions relief in ways that might start to undermine European sanctions and things of that kind. Maybe the Americans are waiting, maybe they're hoping that their friends in Europe, and they do have friends in Europe, Hungary, Slovakia, quietly some other countries, Giorgia Meloni, who's just given a long interview to the Financial Times, she also seems to be increasingly tilting towards the American position. She is saying categorically that she is opposed to the deployment of European forces in Ukraine. She makes it clear that she thinks that this is not an outcome desired by the United States. She accepts that Ukraine needs security guarantees. She is floating the preposterous idea that Ukraine be provided with Article 5 type guarantees by NATO, even whilst staying outside of NATO, something which has provoked bafflement both in Ukraine and apparently in much of Europe, and which, by the way, would be completely unacceptable to the United States, which, during the time of Donald Trump's presidency, has made absolutely clear that it is not going to grant security guarantees to Ukraine in any form, certainly not Article 5 type guarantees. Meloni is bringing up this idea in order to give herself talking points when she meets with European officials, British and French officials, as she explains, as she continues to stress her opposition to these European initiatives and to deploy European peacekeepers to Ukraine, and insists that the Europeans must continue to work hand in hand with the United States. So it could be that the Trump administration is keeping its fingers crossed and hoping that these European countries, Hungary, Slovakia, perhaps Italy, will start to push back against the sanctions because the Trump administration wants them to. The Hungarian Foreign Minister, Peter Szijjártó, is about to visit Moscow for talks with the Russians, and maybe the Trump administration is hoping that when the next series of sanctions comes up for renewal in July, Hungary, with the backing of the United States, will veto that renewal of sanctions, and that will be what breaks the logjam. I don't know, but for the moment, the Americans are doing nothing and saying nothing after, as I said, frantic weeks of talks and negotiations, of Witkoff flying to Moscow, of meetings in Jeddah and Riyadh, of contacts between the Americans and the Russians, of contacts between the Americans and the Ukrainians, of contact between the Americans and the Europeans. We've suddenly reached that point in this process where there is no visible movement at all. Now, it could be things are going on behind the scenes of which I am not aware. But I have to say, I don't think so. Peskov seemed to some people to suggest that maybe Putin and Trump have been in contact with each other and have spoken to each other more often than people know. But I read Peskov's comments carefully. I gained the clear impression that Peskov was basically saying, well, if they have spoken more, I certainly don't know about it. And people ran away and took that to mean that, in fact, the Americans and the Russians have spoken more to each other than people are saying. That was not my impression of Peskov's words. I think people read more into them than he intended. My own view is that there have only been 2 telephone calls between Putin and Trump. And Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, who should know, says that as far as he is aware, well, to his knowledge, the foreign ministry's contacts with the Americans have been sporadic. He said that before the first meeting in Riyadh between the Americans and the Russians, the one he attended, and the one where the American delegation was headed by Marco Rubio, there'd been no prior contacts or preparations at all. So the Russians and the Americans went into the meeting without anything but the sketchiest idea of what the meeting would discuss. That there'd be no real preparation for the meeting between the two sides at all. And I have to say, I got something of the same impression about the last meeting in Riyadh on Monday of this week. That again, there really wasn't that much contact between the Russians and the Americans. That the assumption that there is intensive discussions between the two, that there's negotiations going on all the time, I think myself that is probably wrong. So anyway, we have this pause. Now, into this pause, Putin has now marched in, and he's marched in giving this speech in Murmansk, and it is to that which I will now turn. Now, the Kremlin has provided us with a complete transcript of his words, and they were very interesting. The first thing to say is that he spoke with immense confidence about the military situation. He said that the army is advancing right across the front line, and that he anticipates that the Russians are going to achieve all of the objectives that they set themselves. We are gradually moving towards achieving all the objectives we set for ourselves at the start of the operation. Some would have liked these advances to happen at a quicker pace, but we have gathered steady momentum and have been confidently advancing our positions. So that's what he said, and he also went further subsequently, and he said more. He said that the Russians now control most of the territory of the 4 regions. he said that they control 99% of Lugansk region and 70% of the other 3 regions. And I have to say, from the way he spoke, though he didn't say this explicitly, but from the way he spoke, I could not see that he was retreating from his position set out in his speech to the Foreign Ministry in June last year, that the Russians expect all the territory of the 4 regions to be brought fully back under their control. I don't think that there was any real room in these comments to see possible concessions in that regard. I'll quote his words. As regards the situation along the line of contact, let me reiterate, emphasize across the entire front line, the strategic initiative unequivocally lies with the Russian armed forces. The Lugansk People's Republic has been 99% liberated, whilst the Donetsk People's Republic, the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions stand at over 70%. Our forces, our troops are advancing daily, liberating territory after territory, area after area. And the key word here, it seems to me, is liberating. So when the Russians use that kind of word, they clearly imply, Putin is clearly implying, that the entire 4 regions are Russian, and that this is no longer, as far as he is concerned, a matter which is open to discussion. Now, the remaining part of his speech was, it seemed to me, very much in that same style. He spoke with, I think, continuing bitterness about the way in which he felt that the Western powers had tricked the Russians over the course of the negotiations that had taken place prior to the start of the special military operation. He again rehearsed in enormous detail the topic of the Minsk agreement, the bad faith shown by the Europeans. He actually said that Russia will be careful not to be tricked in the same way again, that we, that is to say the Russians, will never let ourselves be fooled again in that kind of way. So you can see that that isn't the kind of language one expects from someone seeking to make concessions. He did say that he regards Trump as sincere in wanting peace. First and foremost, in my view, the newly elected President of the United States sincerely wishes to end this conflict for a number of reasons. I will not list them now, as they are numerous, but in my opinion, this aspiration is genuine. It's interesting because he suggests that Trump or someone on the American side has given him reasons why the United States wants to end the war, and Trump accepts them. And Putin then goes on to say, we stand for resolving all these issues by peaceful means, as I have just stated, reinforcing the measures we have taken from the very beginning. So he's not rejecting peace negotiations as such, but it's clearly peace negotiations intended to achieve the same objectives that Russia is seeking to achieve through the ongoing war. In other words, the negotiations are simply another path towards realizing Russian objectives as an alternative to the war that is going on now. Putin would rather that it ended peacefully. Why wouldn't he? But it's the attainment of the objectives that, for Putin, remains the ultimate objective. Not merely ending the conflict, as some people say. And I have to say this straight away, that I find that completely unsurprising. Putin took enormous political risks back in February 2022 when he launched the special military operation. He set out his objectives then, which took the form of an order given to the Russian armed forces. Certainly, thousands of men, thousands of Russian soldiers, tens of thousands probably, have been killed or wounded in the fighting. But that will increase the pressure on Putin to ensure that when the war ends, the objective, the mission that he ordered at its start has been fulfilled. Otherwise, what did all those men die or get wounded for? And certainly I think that is the sentiment within Russian society. And Putin went on to discuss at enormous length the internal situation in Ukraine. He spoke again about how the ultra-nationalists, and he used much stronger words to describe them, referencing back to the ideology that existed in Central Europe in the 1930s, and I'm still careful here about what I say. He spoke about how adherents of this ideology have gained immense influence and power in Ukraine, and how unacceptable for Russia that continues to be. He spoke about how these people have been armed and equipped and have become immensely powerful inside Ukraine. He spoke again at great length about the illegality of the present government of Ukraine. He talked about how it originates from a coup that was carried out in Ukraine in February 2014, an illegal seizure of power. He again questioned Zelensky's legitimacy. In fact, he didn't just question it. He said that Zelensky has no legitimacy, that he is illegally established as president of Ukraine. He again made it clear that he does not believe that Zelensky has the authority to sign any final peace agreement. He also said that given that it is Zelensky who occupies his positions illegally and whose actions, therefore, are illegal because they are at variance with the Constitution, who appoints all the key officials in Ukraine, the members of the cabinet, the regional governors, all of that, that none of these people are legally in position because they have been appointed to those positions illegally by someone who has no power to do so. And Putin said that in order for there to be peace in Ukraine, there must therefore be an attempt to address the root causes of the conflict. That essentially means removing the current regime. It means obviously fulfilling the other criteria of the June 2024 speech that Putin gave to the Russian Foreign Ministry. It means implementing the whole of Istanbul, the Istanbul provisions in their entirety, And by the way, he also insisted, and I've no doubt about this, that he's correct, that Istanbul did include significant provisions for the reduction in size of the Ukrainian armed forces, limits on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces, as well as denazification of Ukraine. Those provisions, as far as I'm aware, have not been published, but Putin insists that they are there, that they do exist, that they are part of the original Istanbul Agreement, and he is going to insist on them. So how does he achieve all of this? Well, the Russians no doubt will continue their special military operation. He spoke with great confidence about how it could turn out well. He said, in effect, that the Russians are pushing the Ukrainians back across the contact line, and very suggestively, he suggested that before long, the Russian armed forces would be in a position to finish them, to finish the Ukrainians, in other words, to defeat them militarily. But how to achieve regime change in a legal way, how to create a government in Kiev that can finally negotiate and sign a final agreement, which will be, from what I can see, on Putin's terms. At least that is how Putin envisages it. Well, he's come up with a proposal for a UN trusteeship. International practice follows a well-established path. Within the framework of the United Nations peacekeeping operations, there have been several cases of what is termed external government or temporary administration. This occurred in East Timor, I believe, in 1999. He's right about that, by the way. A friend of mine was part of the UN team that was sent to East Timor for that end. He still works, by the way, for the UN. This occurred in East Timor, I believe, in 1999, in parts of the former Yugoslavia, and in New Guinea. In short, such precedents exist. In principle, it would be possible to discuss under UN auspices with the United States and even European countries, and certainly with our partners and allies, and he gave a long list of who they are: China, India, South Africa, Brazil, North Korea, the BRICS states, all of them, the possibility of establishing a temporary administration in Ukraine. To what end? To conduct democratic elections, to bring to power a competent government that enjoys public trust, and only then to begin negotiations on a peace treaty and sign legitimate agreements that would be recognized worldwide as consistent and reliable. Now, I want to particularly underline these words: to begin negotiations on a peace treaty and sign legitimate agreements that would be recognized worldwide as consistent and reliable. And then Putin went on to say, this is just one option. I do not claim that others do not exist. They certainly do. At present, there is no opportunity and perhaps no possibility to lay out every detail as the situation is evolving rapidly, but this remains a viable option, and such precedence exists within UN practice, as I have already noted. So, what is Putin proposing here? And it is an astonishing proposal, and one which I cannot imagine the Europeans will accept. And, well, I don't know what the Trump people, how they would react to it, but it is an astonishing proposal. It basically says we need to bring the 4 regions under Russian control. Our army is close now to the point where it's going to be able to liberate them anyway. This is not, as far as we are concerned, a topic for discussion. But we do want a long-term durable peace in Ukraine. We want to see a legitimate government that is recognized internationally in place in Kiev, in place of the illegitimate and illegal government of Vladimir Zelensky. We want to see a government that is free of the influence of the ultra-nationalists in Ukraine, one that is able to stand on its own feet and make decisions in the interests of the Ukrainian people. And we want a government that we can negotiate with, come to a mutually satisfactory agreement with, and most importantly, an agreement whose international legality will not be challenged. So that the British, for example, do not set up a government in exile in London and don't continue to tell everybody that the territories that have joined Russia are not really part of Russia at all. They're still part of Ukraine. Putin wants to avoid those scenarios. So he says, why not bring in the UN, have the UN take charge of Ukraine? It's been done before. The job of the UN will be to stabilize the situation, disarm the ultra-nationalist brigades. There would have to be some kind of force inside Ukraine to achieve that. He said, maybe the Americans can be involved. He doesn't seem so keen on the Europeans. But clearly he envisages that the force would come from other places. And he spoke about the BRICS states, China, India, North Korea, which is, of course, not a BRICS state. How the West would react to this, I have no idea. The idea of North Korean troops fulfilling these kind of functions in Ukraine, the mind reels. But anyway, the function of these forces would not be to secure Ukraine from a potential Russian attack. It would be, in effect, to disarm Ukraine, or, to be more precise, to disarm the ultra-nationalist brigades in Ukraine. That would be a threat to any attempt to secure a peace treaty. And then, in these conditions of relative peace, an internationally recognized election could be held, and that will produce a government led by, Putin clearly assumes, a sensible, rational individual, no longer subject to the influence of the ultra-nationalists. And this person would then sign the peace treaty. And all of the countries around the world, including the European countries, would have to accept it, because there is no alternative. There would be no alternative to do so. The agreement would have the backing of the United Nations, and therefore, by extension, of the rest of the international community. It is very much the kind of proposal one can imagine a lawyer coming up with. And as I've discussed in many places and many times, Putin is nothing if not a lawyer. In fact, he recently made that point himself. And it is a neat and elegant solution to the problem of Ukraine from a Russian point of view. Will it work? But the answer is, I'm sure it won't. I cannot imagine the Ukrainians agreeing to this. The Europeans will obviously strongly oppose it. So will probably the Americans. I can't imagine the Americans being very keen on this idea either. Donald Trump doesn't even like the United Nations, just to say. And having a UN force of this kind in Ukraine, I think that it goes too far against what the Trump administration is thinking about. or could even imagine. So what then is left? Well, I think Putin has also outlined it. The fact that the Russians continue to win the war in Ukraine. Several people have said that in this speech in Murmansk, Putin was basically giving the final warning that if the Ukrainians don't come to terms, the Russians will see this thing through to the end. I've not seen words in this speech that refer to any sort of final warning myself, but I accept that in a kind of a way, this is not that far from that. Who knows? But the point is that what Putin is outlining here is a proposal to end the war in Ukraine peacefully on his terms. And that, it seems to me, is the key to understanding his policy. It is going to be ended on his terms, either on the battlefield or on the negotiating table. It will not be ended in any other way. And I mentioned the pressure on Putin from the fact that Russians have died in the fighting, that means that he has to deliver to the Russian people victory. But going beyond that, there is the further factor that Putin is winning the war, as he has said himself. Since the Russians are winning the war, since they've got the military initiative on all parts of the battlefields, as he says, how can he settle for less? Firstly, he is under no obligation to do so. Well, no pressure, perhaps I should say, no pressure to do so. But why would he compromise on his conditions when he is on the brink of victory? It's difficult to see why he would. There might be some situations where he might be interested in doing so. But if so, I wonder whether it would be in this situation. He talks about the long history of betrayal by the Western powers of their various promises to Russia, specifically on the question of Ukraine. He talks about Russia's vital security interests. He has scathing things to say about Britain, by the way. He talks about Boris Johnson, and he ridicules the size of the British military and the British economy. He says that Britain has an economy that's only the 9th in the world. I'm not talking about Great Britain, which is pouncing at us and otherwise behaving aggressively, whilst its economy is only the 9th or 10th largest. This explains the size of its armed forces, which are 170 to 180,000 personnel. This is the armed forces that Great Britain has. How many armed forces does Russia have? Well, of course, their armed forces number in the millions, and Russia has a nuclear deterrence capability that dwarfs that of Britain, as, by the way, he also pointed out. So given that this is so, given that he is in such a strong position, what is going to persuade him, given the prior history, that he should settle for less than he can? I mean, an offer would have to be very tempting. It would have to make major concessions on other issues for him to even consider it. And so far, I've not seen those major concessions being offered by anyone in the West at all. So there we are. That's Putin. A very tough, very hardline speech in some respects. It doesn't shut the door. It goes out of its way to say that he thinks highly of Trump, that Russia is interested in a peaceful settlement. But to reiterate again, it is a peaceful settlement on Russian terms. And it's now quite clear that these terms do involve regime change in Kiev. It might be a legal regime change. That's clearly Putin's preference. One achieved through UN mechanisms. But it would be regime change nonetheless. It would certainly mean the end politically of Vladimir Zelensky and the disarmament of the hardline ultra-nationalist brigades in Kiev. Well, there we go. So that's where we are. Now, where do we go from here? Where does this leave Trump and the United States? Well, I do think we have a clue, because a Ukrainian politician, Yaroslav Zelensky, who is a member of the Ukrainian parliament, has now seen the latest version of the mineral rights extraction agreement that the Trump administration has presented to Ukraine. And someone else who's seen it, by the way, is Ambrose Evans Pritchard, an editor at a writer on economics at the Daily Telegraph. And they are completely horrified by its contents. This time, the agreement is 60 pages long. We're no longer talking about the back of the envelope draft statement of intent that Zelensky was supposed to witness the signature of in late February, over the course of that visit, which ended in the row at the Oval Office. Anyway, I'm going to read what Zelensky, who's seen it, says about it. I received this document yesterday from our government officials. I must say right away that this is not the final document, and I hope that our side will demand and achieve significant changes to it. But the text I saw is downright horrible. All 18 chapters. This is no longer a framework memorandum of intent, which was before the scandalous meeting in the Oval Office. This is a big and very clear agreement, and it is not in our favour. And then Zelensky goes on to say that the key provisions are that all mineral rights across Ukraine, not just rare earths, but oil, gas, everything, the proceeds of it will flow to a special fund. The fund will be managed by 5 people, 3 of whom will be from the United States and who will have full veto power. The fund will supervise the work, not just of public, state-owned Ukrainian companies, but also private companies as well. The fund's money will be immediately converted into currency and taken abroad. US contribution aid already provided to us since 2022 is what Ukraine receives in return for this. In other words, the extraction of funds from Ukraine through this deal by the United States will not be in return for aid which will be given in the future. It will be for aid already previously provided by the Biden administration between 2022 and 2024. It goes on to say, Zelensky goes on to say, The United States can make a profit at its discretion. In this case, they will receive royalties from the fund first. The agreement is indefinite. I pointed out at the time when I saw the draft statement of intent, if we can call it that the Ukrainians were expected to sign during Zelensky's visit to the Oval Office, that was an indefinite agreement. Well, this one also is. Changes to the agreement or its termination are possible only with the permission of the United States. In other words, Ukraine cannot unilaterally exit this agreement. The Americans must agree. The United States has primary rights to all new infrastructure projects, roads, railways, everything, not the European Union notice, which of course Ukraine is seeking to join. The US has primary rights to all new infrastructure projects and veto power over the sale of resources to other countries. So if Ukraine were to join the European Union, but I should quickly add that this agreement is incompatible with European Union membership, then Ukraine would not, as an EU member state, be able to sell its oil, say, to another EU member state. It could only do so with American permission. And there is no hint of security guarantees from the United States. And Zelensky goes on to say that these are just the main points, and there is a lot of legal text. It's 60 pages. So this is a fully fleshed out, utterly overpowering agreement. It would turn Ukraine into a permanent economic colony of the United States. Very difficult to see how Ukraine would be able to develop economically if this agreement were brought into force. And frankly, as I said, it is so incompatible with EU membership that it all but precludes the possibility of Ukraine ever joining the EU. Now, why has the United States, why has the Trump administration proposed such a draconian, such a savage agreement to Ukraine? Could it be that the United States has quietly come to understand that achieving a negotiated solution to the conflict in Ukraine is all but impossible, and that its objective is to propose to the Ukrainians an agreement that is so harsh that the Ukrainians will reject it? And Zelensky says that he doesn't believe that this agreement in its existing form has any chance of being ratified by the Ukrainian parliament, even if Zelensky himself signs it. Could it be that that's the objective, to have the Ukrainians reject this proposal, at which point Donald Trump is able to say, well, the United States has invested all of this money in Ukraine. Ukraine is not prepared to do what is needed to pay it back. The United States cannot go on throwing good money after bad. And in light of Ukraine's behavior and its ingratitude to the United States has no choice but to move on. Now, there's been much speculation about Donald Trump's urgency, about why he is so keen to end the conflict as quickly as possible, other than the humanitarian concerns he has spoken about so often. And there's been suggestions that it's because he's aware about how dangerous the military situation for Ukraine has become, that he also wants Russia's help to broker some kind of deal with Iran, all of those things. I thought about this and I have floated various possibilities myself, but I now have come to the view that there is a much more simple explanation, and that is that Ukraine is likely to run out of weapons and money by midsummer. And if the United States continues to be committed to Ukraine as of that time, then the Ukrainians will come back to the United States and will ask the United States for more weapons and more money. At which point, Trump will be put in the terrible position of having to decide whether to cut Ukraine off by saying no, or possibly to go to Congress and ask for more, which would be deeply unpopular with many people in his MAGA faction, and which would be inconsistent with everything he has said about the conflict with Ukraine, in Ukraine up to now. So, he wants to escape being put in that position. So that may be why he wants a peace agreement. He wants a truce, so he doesn't have to go back to Congress or exercise his drawdown authority again before August. If he can't get that, and he must be sensing by now that the chances of getting it are very slim, well, he's got to find himself an excuse to get out. And it could be that drafting the mineral rights extraction agreement in these terms is his way to try to do that. It does carry risks. What if the Ukrainians say yes? What if they sign the agreement and ratify? What does the United States do then? In theory, it is even more deeply committed to Ukraine in that case than it is now. But this is my sense of what it is that Donald Trump is trying to do. As for Putin, his objective remains the one that he set out at the commencement of the war in February 2022, to ensure that Ukraine remains neutral outside NATO, that it's denuclearized, as he puts it, demilitarized, that there are severe restrictions on its armed forces, and that the entire political character of the country is changed, perhaps in anticipation that one day it will then start to drift back into Russia's geopolitical orbit. I don't think Putin has ever wavered from these objectives. I think that since June 2024, he's added to those objectives control of the 4 regions, and I don't think he's prepared to budge on that either. One way or the other, I think he intends to achieve these objectives. He would prefer to do so peacefully, in harmony, and working together with Donald Trump, or in the alternative, he will push on and do it by force. He appears to believe that his army is on the brink of winning in Ukraine. He said that the time has come to basically finish it. He may be right about that. It may be that there's an awful lot more difficult fighting still to do. But that, I suspect, is what Putin thinks. Well, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. If I carry on much longer, I suspect that again I will be overstraining my voice. So tomorrow I will look at these things in more detail again. We'll look at the military situation as well, and we'll see whether Trump and the Americans are going to move forward from this position of basically inactivity, which is the one that they're in at the moment. Well, thank you again. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember to tick the like button if you like this video and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.